Turn your Bibles, if you will, to 1 Timothy chapter 6. 1 Timothy chapter 6. We're going to be reading verses 17 through 19 to set the stage for the lesson. Take the opportunity to welcome everybody here. If we do have any visitors, I don't see any tonight, but if you are here and I missed you, we're glad you're here, and we want you to come back and be with us anytime you have opportunity. In 1 Timothy 6, verse 17, Paul says, "Command those who are rich in this present age not to be haughty, nor trust in uncertain riches, but in the living God who richly gives us all things to enjoy. Let them do good, that they be rich in good works, ready to give, willing to share, storing up for themselves a good foundation for the time to come, that they may lay hold of eternal life." This text reminds us to be always ready to help the needy. And I might add this too, just by way of context. This verse is talking to you and me. You know, we think, command those who are rich. That's talking about Donald Trump. No, it's talking about you and me. Compared to the world's standards, you and I are rich. Even the poorest one in the building, whoever that may be. I'm not asking for a show of hands, but whoever that may be, we're rich by world standards. A lot of people in this world don't have a place to lay their head. They live, and in some places in the world, people live in grass huts. We who live in the United States are richly blessed. We have plenty of food, we have plenty of clothing, we have plenty of shelter. And so passages like this aren't talking necessarily to people like Donald Trump, although he would be included, but they're talking to people like you and me, because by world standards, we are rich. We are well off. But it reminds us to always be ready to help the needy. And there's a great danger in this land of plenty. I just talked about how richly blessed we were. Here we are in these good old United States, and even in our economic downturn that we've been going through for about the last 3.5 years, even in that, we have a land of plenty, and if we're not careful, we can have a tendency to look down upon the poor and perhaps even neglect them. Now with that, I want you to turn back to the Old Testament, to the book of Amos just a second. Amos chapter 6, read a few verses here. And the same sin was being committed by the Jewish people against some of their own. They were doing so well financially that they were kind of looking down their noses at the poor and not offering to help them in any way, shape, or form. And that's what I'm saying. By our own affluence, sometimes, if we're not careful, we can neglect the poor or maybe even look down our noses at the poor. And this is what Amos is speaking of here. Amos 6, verse 3. He says, "Woe to you who put far off the day of doom." I want to make sure I'm reading the right verse. "Who cause the seat of violence to come near. Who lie on beds of ivory. Stretch out on your couches, eat lambs from the flock and calves from the midst of the stall, who sing idly to the sound of string instruments and invent for yourselves musical instruments like David, who drink wine from bowls and anoint yourselves with the best ointments." Now let me just stop right there. He's talking about a people who are doing well financially. That's really what he's discussing here. And he's saying, verse 3, the day of doom, that's the day of judgment that's coming for them because of their sins. And he said, you're putting it out of your mind, not even thinking about it, and you sit back on your beds of ivory, and that would be an expensive type of bed is what he's talking about. You sit back on your beds of ivory and you stretch out on your couch. You eat your lambs from the flock. You're doing well. You're doing great. You're blessed. You sing idly. You got plenty of time. You can sing the music, you see. You can even invent musical instruments. You got so much time on your hands and so much money. And you drink wine from bowls. You got the fancy stuff, you see. But in the middle of verse 6, here's the problem. You're not grieved for the affliction of Joseph. You're not thinking about the poor. You're set back, reared back in all your high and mighty stuff, and you're overlooking and neglecting the poor. You're not grieved for the affliction of Joseph. Therefore, they shall go now captive as the first captives, and those who recline at banquets shall be removed. And so there is a danger in this land of plenty to not think very much about the poor, to kind of put it out of our mind, kind of like they did there in Amos chapter 6. And then I'll add something else on that. Some of us, as Christians, we're so religiously conservative, and by the way, there's nothing wrong with being religiously conservative, but there's a danger to that. We're so religiously conservative that we're afraid we're going to do something wrong when it comes to helping the poor. And we're so afraid that we're going to do something wrong, we don't do anything at all. And brethren, that's just not acceptable. That's just not acceptable. But that's what happens to us. And John reminds us in 1 John 3, remember that in 1 John 3:17, he says, whoever has this world's goods, that's us, whoever has this world's goods and sees his brother in need and closes up his heart of compassion, how does the love of God abide in him? And of course, the answer is it doesn't. And he goes on to say in the next verse, verse 18, my little brethren, he says, let us not love in word or in tongue, but in deed and in truth. And so I'm suggesting to you the dangers of the affluent society in which we live. We can become so fat and complacent that we don't think about the poor, who perhaps are, to use a biblical expression, lying at our gate. Sometimes we don't even think about those people. So I think it's important to just stop and study this very vital subject about benevolence. And I'm talking about benevolence in general, not just the local church, although we'll get to that eventually. I'm talking about benevolence in general and what all's involved. And it's actually a lot more complicated subject than you might think once you start digging into it. Well, we're talking about helping the needy, so the first thing we want to do is identify the needy. What is a need? And I think it's important in terms of this study that we distinguish between a genuine need and a want. Sometimes we want things, but we tell ourselves we need them. You know, we say, I need a brand new car. Do you? Do you really? Could you not do with a used car? Could you not do with a car that's a little bit older? We convince ourselves that our wants are our needs. And sometimes we get that mixed up. And we're talking about needs here. I'm talking about identifying what is a genuine need, not just what somebody wants to have. You know, as I served as an elder up there at Fisher's for about 15 years, there were a lot of people who came through with needs, but sometimes those needs weren't really needs. They were just wants. I want this and I want that. Well, that's not a need, you see. So we have to learn to distinguish between what a need is and what a want is. And so I'm going to try and lay down some biblical principles on that. First of all, when we think in terms of basic needs, what is it that every person has to have to survive? And I would suggest to you there's about 4 things. Food. You got to have food. You're not going to live very long without food. Got to have clothing, especially with the weather extremes. When it gets cold in the winter, you got to have coats. You got to have heavier clothing. In the summer, you got to have lighter clothing. So food and clothing and shelter. You need a roof over your head so that you don't freeze to death in the winter and you don't cook in the summer. You need a roof over your head. And then the 4th thing, medical attention. Now let's see if I can back that up with Scripture. Okay? Let's go to Matthew chapter 6. Matthew chapter 6. This is from the Sermon on the Mount. And Jesus is talking about needs here. And he's telling us not to worry about our basic needs. If we're serving the Lord, He'll take care of our needs. But notice the language here, Matthew 6, verse 31 and 32. And He said, therefore, do not worry, saying, what shall we eat? There's food. What shall we drink? There's liquid, there's water or liquid. And what shall we wear? There's shelter, both in clothing, okay, particularly in clothing, but I would expand that to include a roof over your head. But notice that. What shall we eat? What shall we drink? What shall we wear? Those are basic needs. Now read on. For after all these things the Gentiles seek, for your heavenly Father knows that you need. See that? You need all these things. Those are needs, aren't they? Food is a need. Water is a need. Clothing is a need. A new car is not necessarily a need. You see the difference? There's a difference between what we actually need and what we sometimes want. And so we're talking about needs here. And then that 4th category, I said medical attention. Medical attention. Well, let's look at this in Luke chapter 10. We're familiar with this story. Luke chapter 10, I'm just going to read about verse 30 to 35. And Jesus answered and said, a certain man went down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he fell among the thieves who stripped him of his clothing, wounded him, and departed, leaving him half dead. By chance a certain priest came down that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side, a priest being the religious man. Get that? And that's where we started this lesson. Sometimes we ignore needs that are right in front of our face. This was supposedly a man of God, a priest. And he ignored a need that was right in front of his face. He passed by on the other side. Likewise, a Levite, another religious man. When he arrived at the place, he came, and he looked and passed by on the other side. But a certain Samaritan, And this is where the story takes an interesting turn. You see, the Samaritans were despised by the Jews. They were sort of a mixed breed of Jews and Gentiles, and so the Jews kind of looked down their noses at them. It was a racial thing, is what it really come down to. And so here's the man that the Jews despised, but he was the one who had the compassion. Isn't that interesting? And so a certain Samaritan, as he journeyed, he came where he was, and he saw him, and he had compassion on him. And he went to him, and he bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. I wonder why. Because he needed that. He was going to die. They left him half dead. If you'd left him laying out there, he would have died, you see. So he needed his wounds bandaged so it wouldn't bleed out. He needed the oil and the wine. Those were medicinal things used in those days. Wine was somewhat of an antiseptic. There were properties not only in the alcohol, but in the polyphenols in the wine that were antiseptic type properties. And you mixed them together, and it kind of boosted those properties. This is well-known information from the Mediterranean world. And oil was used medicinally. So he provided him with the medications, the bandages, the oil, and the wine. And he set him on his own animal and brought him to an inn. There's your shelter. He needed that too. If he'd left him laying out there on the road, he'd have died out there, you see. He brought him to an inn and took care of him. And on the next day when he departed, he took out 2 denarii. And he gave them to the innkeeper, and he said, you take care of him. And when whatever more you spend, when I come again, I'll repay you. So here it is. I'll take care of the expenses. And when I come back, if you've spent more than what I gave you, I'll make it up to you, you see. But he took care of his needs. This guy needed it. So I'm using those scriptures to illustrate the idea of a need, distinguishing a need from a want. And a need, our needs are basic. Food, clothing, shelter, and medical care. Now, when I say medical care, essential medical care. There's a difference between a life-saving heart surgery and elective liposuction. Elective liposuction is not a need. That's a want, you see. And so that's what we're talking about here, needs. Now, let's get down to some specifics here. What might that include? If we're trying to help a needy person, how might that come down to you and I in a real way? Well, if a person has to have shelter, maybe you need to help them with their rent sometimes. That's a legitimate thing. Shelter is a legitimate need. You might need to help them with their rent sometimes. If medical care, essential medical care, is a need, then maybe you need to help pay for their medicine. Maybe you need to help them pay a hospital bill if the person is in need and can't meet their obligation. A phone can actually be a need in some circumstances. Think about that for just a second. We would first, the initial reaction is say, no, you don't need a phone. But there are some people whose medical condition is so touchy that if something gets off, they've got to have access to a doctor right now. And they need that phone. So a phone can be a need. Not always a need, but it can be a need, you see. And so I'm trying to spell out the idea of what is a need and what is not a need. And our needs are very few and our needs are very basic. Food, clothing, shelter, and very basic essential medical care. Those are actual needs. Now I want to add something else to this discussion when we think about identifying the needing, because I've seen some brethren sometimes who get very, very stingy. And someone comes in and they ask for help and they say, well, he's got $50 in his wallet. And he's not in need, he's got $50 in his wallet. Listen to me. Listen to me. You don't have to be completely destitute to be considered poor. Can I say that again? You don't have to be completely destitute to be considered poor. Look with me here at the book of Leviticus. Leviticus chapter 14. And Moses was talking about certain needy people, or poor people I should say, poor people among them. And even though they were poor, they were still expected to offer some kinds of sacrifices here. In the context, he's talking about the cleansing of lepers. And so if a leper was cleansed, or how to get a leper cleansed, you see. And you get down here, I'm cutting to the chase here, verse 21. Leviticus 14, verse 21. But if he is poor, stop right there. He's poor, okay? He says if he's poor, we're talking about a poor man here, and he cannot afford it, and the Bible describes him as poor, then he shall take one male lamb. Well, I thought he was poor. How do you have a male lamb? And that's the point I'm trying to make. You don't have to be completely destitute without a dollar to your name in order to be considered poor. You can be poor and still have a little something, you see. And this man, even though he's poor, he's got a lamb to offer as a trespass offering, doesn't he? And he says, not only that, But he says an ephah of fine flour, he's got access to that. Well, we can't help him. He's got an ephah of flour and he's got a lamp. We can't help him. Well, that's not the ideal at all. You don't have to be totally, completely destitute, having nothing, before you're considered poor, you see. And I think that's an important point. And so hopefully all of that information has helped us to kind of put this in perspective about who is in need and who is not in need. Now, let's move into the next section here, and let's talk about the causes of need. There are a whole host of reasons why someone might become in need of help. We have a tendency to just lump it all into one category. Well, if he's poor, he's lazy. You ever heard people say that? Well, that might be true, but that's not always true by a long shot. And that's what I want to address here in this section of the lesson. Just because somebody is poor does not automatically mean they're lazy. It might mean they're lazy, but it doesn't necessarily mean they're lazy. So let's talk about some causes of need. The first one on the list, by the way, is laziness. That'll surely put you in need. If you're not willing to work, you'll certainly be a person in need. Over in 2 Thessalonians chapter 3 and verse 10, Paul talked about this. 2 Thessalonians 3:10, we all know this verse. We quote it all the time. Paul says, when we were with you, we commanded you this. If anyone will not work, stop. Notice what he said. Will not work. He didn't say cannot work. He's not talking about disabled people here. Sometimes people get disabled and they can't work, or sometimes people get so old that they can't work. So he's not saying anyone that cannot work. He says someone who will not work. He's able-bodied, but he just won't do it. He's lazy. And so if anyone will not work, neither shall he eat. You don't help that fella. Now he's in need all right. Yeah, he's in poverty all right. Yeah, he could use a little help all right, but he's too lazy to even help himself. That guy, he said, you just let him starve, you see. You just let him starve. That's one cause of need, but it's not the only one. And we have a tendency to just lump everybody under that category. Well, if you need something, it's because you're lazy. Well, that's not necessarily true, and that's what the rest of this is going to be talking about here. There are people who, because nobody taught them any better, or because they don't have any self-control, who are wasteful. That's another cause of need. Over in the book of Proverbs chapter 21. Proverbs chapter 21. A couple of verses here I want to look at. Proverbs 21 verse 17. He who loves pleasure will be a poor man, and he who loves wine and oil will not be rich. Now, wine and oil, those are the fancy things of life. Those are the expensive things. So he's saying here, sometimes people try to eat, they want to try and eat, I can't remember how the saying goes, but they want to live high on the hog, but they don't have enough. We'll just put it that way. There's a saying that covers that. But they want to live high on the hog, but they don't have enough. I want the good stuff. I want the finer things. And they waste and they waste and they waste. Look at that. He who loves pleasure will be a poor man. If you have to have the finest of everything. Let me see if I can make an illustration of this in everyday life. I've seen people, every time a new phone comes out, got to have it. Got to have it. Got to have that brand new phone. And they just got one a couple of years ago. Nothing wrong with it. And they spent about $1,500 for that. But got to have a new one. New one come out, got to have that new one. New computer comes out, got to have that new computer. New game, got to have that new game. And they'll spend hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of dollars on these things, all because they got to have the best and the finest and the most. What's the matter with you? You're being wasteful. You're being wasteful. You just think about the money that we waste here. And so if you're the kind of person that just always has to have the finer things, be careful. Be careful, because if you can't afford it, you're going to put yourself in the poorhouse. Verse 18, the wicked shall be ransomed for the righteous, and I said 18, I'm sorry, verse 20 is what I'm looking for. There is desirable treasure and oil in the dwelling of the wise, but the foolish man squanders it, wasting it, you see. The wise man saves it. So he's got oil. He's got what he needs because he saves. And he's looking out for that rainy day. But the foolish man, he got to spend every dime he gets. Every time a dollar comes in, I got to spend it. I got to spend it. It's burning a hole in my pocket, you see. And so sometimes we're needy because we're wasteful. Well, that's not very good either. The Bible doesn't speak very highly of that. And sometimes we're needy because of other sins that we might commit. Turn now, if you will, to Proverbs 23. Proverbs 23, verses 19 to 21. And Solomon says, hear, my son, and be wise. Guide your heart in the way. Do not mix with wine-bibbers, nor with gluttonous eaters of meat, for the drunkard and the glutton will come to poverty. Why? Well, alcohol is expensive, and food's expensive. And if you have to eat all the time and drink all the time, pretty soon you're going to run out of money, see? So people are wasteful is the ideal. They're wasteful. And so sometimes because of sinful habits, like gluttony, like drunkenness, like drugs, you have sinful habits, and that can bring need upon you. Now, though the Bible doesn't speak highly of those kinds of situations because the person got themselves. It's self-inflicted, if you might say. Self-inflicted need. But sometimes needs are inflicted by others. Have you ever thought about that? Sometimes other people cheat you. In Proverbs 28 and verse 8. Here's a man who's dishonest in business. One who increases his possessions by usury and extortion gathers it for him who will pity the poor. Usury is excessive interest. Oh, I'll loan you money. I'll loan you money, but it's going to cost you. And it's going to cost you a whole lot. And I think sometimes I can't even help but think of some of these modern-day credit card companies. You ever looked at your credit card and looked at the interest rate on it? I think a lot of people just pay theirs off month by month. That's probably the best way to do it if you use a credit card. But just look into that interest rate on a credit card. It's 18%, 20%. That's thievery. That's thievery. And they can do it. And so think about that, and that's what he's saying here. A person who increases his possessions by usury, excessive interest, and extort, he's dishonest, and he inflicts that on other people. I know he's going to need money. He's going to come to me, and boy, I'm going to have him over a barrel then. I'll loan him the money, but he's going to owe me twice as much back, you see. And so that's dishonest. That's inflicting it on, that's others inflicting a need upon you, you see. They're putting you in that situation. And then there's another example of this in James chapter 5. James chapter 5 and verse 4. James talks about how certain men didn't pay their workers their wages. James 5 and verse 4. Indeed, the wages of the laborers who mowed your fields. You hired them to do a job. You hired them to go out and mow your fields. But he said the wages which you kept back by fraud, you cheated them. You owed them that money, and now they don't have any money because you won't pay them. And so needs can be inflicted by other people, you see. And that's not a good thing, but it happens. And he said, you kept out those wages by fraud, and those wages are crying out. And the cries of the reapers have reached the ears of the Lord of Sabaoth. The word Sabaoth means host, the Lord of hosts. He is the Lord of all, the Lord of all people and all things, you see. And he's saying God is watching this. Sometimes needs are inflicted because of persecution. Over in the book of Hebrews chapter 10. Hebrews chapter 10, verses 32 to 34. Look at what some of the early Christians had to go through. We never had to go through things like this for our faith. I don't think. Maybe some of you have, but I never have. Hebrews 10, verse 32. He reminds them, he says, you recall the former days. Think back into the past. Which after you were illuminated, that is, after you heard the gospel and you accepted it, you endured a great struggle with sufferings. What kind of sufferings? Partly while you were made a spectacle by reproaches and tribulations, and partly while you became companions of those who were so treated. And so persecution was brought upon Christians. He says, you had compassion upon me in my chains, and listen to this, and joyfully accepted the plundering of your goods. Sometimes in countries that persecute Christians, they'll just burst in, they'll take your property, they'll take your house, they'll take your car just because you're a Christian. Now, I've never had anything like that happen to me, have you? It doesn't happen to us in this country, at least not yet. But it happens in some places. It happened to these Christians, and now I'm in need. Wasn't lazy, you see that? Wasn't neglectful, but persecution brought a need upon me. So there's all kinds of reasons why a person might be in need. Sometimes circumstances bring us into need. Right now, as I mentioned earlier, we're going through an economic downturn. Things are not well. Depression or recession, depending on the terminology you want to use. Depression or recession, that can cause people to be in need. Disease. Disease afflicts a land and great expenses. Maybe somebody gets sick in the family and you have to have a lot of expenses to help that person's medical care, you see. And because you've had to help them, now you're hurting, you see. And so disease can bring poverty. War can bring poverty. You think about what is that, the Ukraine, what's going on over there with the Russians and Ukrainians and over there in Israel and all of the destruction, and people, their homes are blown up. Their places of business are blown up. And how am I going to make a living? And where am I going to live? And so circumstances can bring need upon us. A hurricane can run through a town and level it in a matter of minutes. Just level it to the ground. And then your home is gone, your place of business is gone, and you've got nothing, you see. Earthquake, flood, fire. You can have a fire destroy everything you have, you see. And so there's a lot of different reasons why someone might be needy. That's the point that I'm making here. And here's one we never even think about. There are people who choose to live a life of poverty. You say, well, why would anybody do that? Well, the apostles did, didn't they? Turn with me, if you will, to Matthew chapter 10. Matthew chapter 10. I said Matthew 10, I'm sorry, it's Mark 10. Mark chapter 10, verse 28. Peter made an interesting little statement here. Peter began to say to him, see, we, notice the we, not I, it's we, all of us disciples, all of us apostles, we have left all and followed you. Remember when Jesus called them early on and, they were out there fishing? Come follow me, I'll make you fishers of men. Dropped their fishing business and started following Jesus. They chose a life of poverty. They chose that, you see, in order to serve the Lord. And the point I'm making with all this, the reason I'm going through all that, is because we have this idea sometimes, if somebody's in poverty, they're automatically lazy. That's not true. That's just not true. It might be that they're lazy, but there might be 100 other reasons why they're in need. Might be sickness, might be disease, might be disaster. It might be other people have taken advantage of them. There might be 150 different reasons why somebody could be in need. Poverty does not necessarily equate to laziness. And what happens is that becomes our lazy excuse. I don't have to help him because he's lazy. And you never even bothered to look into it to see if really that was the problem or if it was something else. God will not look kindly upon that. We need to be aware and not just assume that someone is lazy and that's why they're in need. If that's why they're in need, then they can just stew in their own juice. Fine. If he will not work, neither shall he eat. But there may be other reasons why a person is in need, and that's why I thought it was important to deal with that. Well, let's talk about some helpers of the needy. Helpers of the needy. Some lines of defense. What has God put in place? In his good providence, what has he put in place to help us stay out of need? And I'd like to suggest about 4 things. The first line of defense is good old-fashioned self-reliance. I'm going to take care of me. And I think that's an important principle. Over in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verses 11 and 12. Paul talks about the Christian life. And he says, verse 11, I want you to aspire to lead a quiet life, to mind your own business, and to work with your own hands. Boy, that's good advice, isn't it? Aspire to lead a quiet life. Don't you be a disruption to the society around you. Just put your head down and live your life. You don't have to have all the attention. You aspire to lead a quiet life. Mind your own business. Well, that's good advice, isn't it? And work with your own hands. And why do I need to do that? Why do I need to work with my own hands? He says that you may walk properly toward those who are outside and that you may lack nothing. That you may lack nothing. First line of defense, take care of yourself. That's important in this society today. We live in a society today where people just stick their hand out and say, government, Uncle Sam, drop it in there. Drop it in there. Well, that's unacceptable. The first line of defense in taking care of your needs is you get up and do something, you see. So the first line of defense, self-reliance. Second line of defense, family. Our family is there or should be there for us, and we should be there for them. In 1 Timothy chapter 5. 1 Timothy chapter 5, a couple of verses here, verse 8 and verse 16. And notice carefully the language of verse 8. If anyone does not provide for his own, and that means his own family, okay? But watch this now. If anyone does not provide for his own, and especially for those of his household. You see that little phrase right there? That means it's not limited. He said especially for those of his household, but there may be family outside your house. family who live in other houses, you see. You got to take care of them too. If anyone will not provide for his own, especially for those of his own household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. That's a pretty sad place to be. That's the way God sees it. You're worse than an atheist. If you won't help your own family, you're worse than an atheist. That's pretty strong stuff right there, isn't it? Verse 16, if any believing man or woman has widows. So here you are, a believer, and you got somebody in your family, in this case it's a widow. You got somebody in your family that needs help. Any believing man or woman has widows, let them relieve them, and do not let the church be burdened. Don't you turn that over to somebody else. That's your family. That's your family. You take care of them. You take care of mama. You take care of daddy. You take care of grandma. You take care of grandpa. You take care of family. Family takes care of family. That's the second line of defense. Okay? First line of defense, self-reliance. Second line of defense, family. Third line of defense, other individuals outside the family. In the book of Galatians chapter 6 and verse 10, we all know the verse. Paul says, and as we have opportunity, therefore, let us do good to all, especially to those who are of the house of faith. Notice there's that language again, especially of those of the household. He didn't say exclusively to those or only to those, but he said take care of everybody, and especially those of the household of faith. So the third line of defense, other individuals, your friends, your neighbors, your co-workers, and by the way, other Christians. We should be first in line. If we have an opportunity to help somebody and we know the situation, we know the need, we should be right there ready to help, you see. So that's the third line of defense. Fourth line of defense that God has provided, various organizations. It has not always been the case, I don't think, but in our society today, governments largely have a great deal of benevolent activity that they do. Now, we can debate, and that's part of our political debate system. You know, is that really the role of government? Should government be doing that? Well, whether they should or whether they shouldn't, they do. Okay? And that help is there, and it's available. And so government entities can help the needy, and they do. Charities, various charities. And I tried to think of a couple here. I jotted them down on my notes. The Wounded Warrior Project. What a great charity that is. When you think, have you ever seen those commercials? They're just some great stories. Just some great stories about the Wounded Warrior Project. The Red Cross. So there's various organizations that you can turn to. And I don't know if they do it around here, but when I was in Cumberland County, every time there would be somebody who maybe was in need, and they called it a benefit. Y'all ever do that around here? They call it a benefit. Have a benefit auction for somebody who was in need. And there's the community stepping in, you see. And so various types of organizations. So these are various lines of defense. Now I told you, boy, my time's going fast here. I'm talking too much. But we need to talk about the role of churches in all of this, because the churches do have a role, but it's a limited role. And we want to talk about that for a few minutes. The role of congregations in terms of helping the needy. I want to make about 5 points here, and I'll have to make them quickly because of time constraints. But the first thing I want you to think about in terms of the role of churches. Number one, the role of churches is distinct from the role of individuals. We saw that earlier in 1 Timothy 5 and verse 16. Let's go back and look at that again. Because a lot of people, the reason this is important, a lot of people think, well, whatever the individual can do, the church can do. That's just simply not true. It's not biblical. That's not Bible teaching. But you hear a lot of people say that. And in 1 Timothy 5 and verse 16, he says, if any believing man or woman has widows, there's the individual. You got needy people in your family. If any believing man or woman has widows, let them relieve them, and do not let the church be burdened. Don't you turn them over to the church. That's your job, you see. That's your job. You've got them. They're your family. You take care of them. And then he says, don't forget the rest of the verse, that it what? The church. It has an obligation. That it may relieve those who are really widows. And in the context, the real widows, as he describes there in verse 5, she who is really a widow and left alone, look at that, she's got nobody else to turn to. She got no family to turn to. See, she got nobody to turn to. She's left alone. She trusts in God. She's a Christian. And she continues in supplications and prayers night and day. She's a faithful Christian. So churches do have a role, but their role is definitely more limited and more restricted. They have a role, but it is limited. The limitation, number 2, is to needy Christians. Turn over to Acts chapter 11. Acts chapter 11. And this is an interesting passage, because if there was ever a passage in the Bible that would teach a role of general benevolence for the church, it would be right here. I want you to think about the circumstances. Acts chapter 11, verse 28 through 30. 27, start with 27. In those days, prophets came from Jerusalem to Antioch. And one of them, one of the prophets, named Agabus, stood up and showed by the Spirit that there's going to be a great famine throughout all the world. Get that. There's a famine that's going to touch everybody throughout all the world, which also happened in the days of Claudius Caesar. By the way, for whatever it's worth, Josephus makes reference to this famine that occurred during the days of Claudius Caesar. You can read about that in his writings if you're interested. But he says, then the disciples, that's the church, each according to his ability, determined to send relief to the whole world. That ain't what it says, is it? That ain't what it says. If there was ever a passage that showed that would show that the church has an obligation to the whole world, right here it would be, and it's not here. It says they determined to receive relief to the brethren dwelling in Judea. The church has a limited role, limited to the needy saints. And this they did, it says, and sent it to the elders by the hands of Barnabas and Saul. Now I will say this, because I think it's important to make this distinction. Some of that money that's sent to needy brethren might end up helping an unbeliever here or there. Let me explain to you what I mean. If there are Christians who have an unbelieving spouse, what would you do? If you're in need and the church is going to hand you some money to take care of yourself and your wife needs money too, you going to help her? Sure you are. Sure you are. Of course you are. Who wouldn't? And what if you got children who haven't obeyed the gospel? You reckon you're going to feed them with that money? Sure you are. Of course you are. So needy, I'll just put it this way, needy saints and their dependents. The role of the church is to the saints, without a doubt. But those saints sometimes have dependents in their homes that are not Christians. Don't have a fit. Just let it go. That's fine. Because you'd do the same thing if it were you. You'd help your kids even if they hadn't obeyed the gospel. You'd help your wife or your husband even if they weren't a Christian. Wouldn't you? Sure you would. And so the church has a limited role, limited to the needs of the saints. Number 3, the role of churches is circumstantial. I think that's important. Churches didn't set themselves up as benevolent entities. Let's look for all the needs we can find. You know, this is where a lot of churches today drop the ball. Let's just go out and start looking for needs and and that's not what happened in the Bible. In the Bible, when churches got involved, it was always geared to circumstance. Acts 11 is a great example of that. The church didn't do anything until they found out there was a need coming. And then they acted. They didn't create a need. They didn't go looking for a need. But when the circumstance arose that they were aware of, then they acted, you see. So it's circumstantial. Number 4, and this is important. The work of the local church in benevolence is a secondary work. It's not the primary work of the church. The primary work of the church has to do with spreading the gospel. That's our primary mission. Paul said that the church is the pillar and the ground of the truth. 1 Timothy 3 and verse 15. Our primary mission involves preaching the gospel, evangelizing, reaching out to the lost, and building up the saints. And there's a great example of this in Acts chapter 6. Look at this situation, Acts 6. Verses 1 through 4, I guess, would be enough. In those days when the number of the disciples was multiplying, there arose a murmuring against the Hebrews by the Hellenists because their widows were neglected in the daily distribution. Then the 12 summoned the multitude of the disciples, and they said, it's not desirable that we should leave the word of God and serve tables. Therefore, brethren, seek out from among you 7 men of good reputation, full of the Holy Spirit and wisdom, whom we may appoint over this business. But we will give ourselves continually to prayer and to the ministry of the word. We have a primary obligation here. We got to take care of this. It's a legitimate need. We got to do something about it because of the circumstances here. It popped up and we got to deal with it. But our primary focus here is on preaching the Word of God. And so let's appoint some men to take care of this. And so that's the point I'm making, is it's a secondary work. It's not a primary work. The church is not a glorified Red Cross. It's not. It's a spiritual entity. Its main mission, its main task is spreading the gospel. And then fifthly, the fifth limitation on churches is that needs supplied by local churches are temporary. It's never to be an ongoing thing. You know, the government, they set up situations for needy people, and it becomes an ongoing thing. Well, we've given this person welfare all their life, and now they've got 10 children, and we're giving them welfare all their life, and they got about 50 children now, the next generation, and we're giving them welfare all their life. It's never designed to be that kind of a permanent setup. Local church benevolence is supposed to be temporary. And really, if you get right down to it, that's the way it should be in all benevolence, until you can get back on your feet. It's not supposed to be a permanent handout. It's supposed to be until you can get back on your feet. For this, I want to go to 2 Corinthians 8. I'm just going to briefly touch on it today because we'll cover it next week in our Sunday morning Bible study. But 2 Corinthians 8, verses 13 to 15. And here you had a situation where the church at Corinth and the churches of Macedonia were trying to help the needy saints in Jerusalem. And he lays down an interesting principle here, verses 13, 14, and 15. That's about where we're ready to start next Sunday morning, by the way. He says, I do not mean that others should be eased and you burdened. He's talking about other churches, okay? I don't mean that other churches should be eased and you burdened and you take care of all their needs all the time, but by an equality, that now at this time your abundance, you have more than you need, may supply their lack. They don't have what they need. That their abundance, someday down the road, may also supply your lack. That there may be an equality. Now there's a necessary implication. This isn't forever. We're just doing this till you can get back on your feet. That's all this is. It's just temporary to just get you back on your feet and get you steady again, and then the help stops, you see. And then maybe someday we'll be the ones and you can step up and help us. We helped you today, and maybe 20 years later you can help us, you see. And he calls that equality. When he says equality, he doesn't mean that each church has the same number of dollars in their treasury. That's not what he means. He just means that they're all free from lack, free from need, you see. So those are some of the limitations in the role of churches. Let me review them again quickly. The role of churches is distinct from individuals. The role of churches is limited to needy Christians and their dependents, as I said earlier. The role of local churches is geared to circumstance. We don't create needs and we don't go looking for them, but when the circumstance arises, we try to do what we can. The role of local churches, benevolence is a secondary function. It's not a primary function. And in the role of local churches, benevolence is a temporary thing. It's not a permanent thing. It's not a permanent handout forever. It's a temporary thing until you can get back on your feet. I hope, if nothing else, and I said a lot in the last 40 minutes or so. I don't know how long the sermon's been. I look at the clock. It's 5 till. I better wind this thing up. But I hope you can see this subject's a little bit more complicated than we think. When you start digging into it, there's a lot of factors here. There's a lot of things to consider. There's a lot of various topics to touch on. So let us, as we summarize here, let us learn compassion for others. Let us act on that compassion so that we can help people who are in genuine need. Because neglect may cost us our very souls. You remember that judgment parable Jesus told in Matthew 25? And he said, depart from me, you cursed, into the everlasting fire prepared for the devil and his angels. You ever thought about what he said there? Well, why? Why are you sending us to hell? Because you're rapists, murderers, and thieves. That's not what he said there. Is now, they'll go to hell too, all right? But in that passage, I was hungry, and you gave me no food. I was a stranger, and you didn't take me in. I was naked, and you didn't clothe me. These are what we call the little things, aren't they? The little things. But they're not little things with God. They're big things. And the reason this is important is because not doing this right can cost us our souls. These shall go away into everlasting punishment, Jesus said. Everlasting punishment, yeah, for neglecting benevolent actions. Think about that. That's a real sobering passage, isn't it, when you think about it in its context. Well, take out your songbooks, turn to the Song of Invitation. I need to wrap this up, so we'll do that. Number 283. 283. There's a great day coming, and indeed there is. The great judgment day when we'll all be gathered before the Lord, and sentence will be pronounced. By the way, understand this, that judgment day is not going to be a trial. I think sometimes we get that idea. There's going to be a trial, and the devil's going to be the prosecuting attorney, and you got to make a defense. No, that's not what's happening. Judgment day is sentencing day. Judgment day is sentencing day. It's not a trial. The trial is right now. The trial is going on right now. What are you doing? What are you doing for the Lord? Are you serving the Lord, or are you not serving the Lord? This is the trial. And on the judgment day, it's time for the sentence. Heaven or hell. Not going to be a trial. is going to be heaven or hell based on what you've done in the body. Wake up and realize what's happening. If you need to obey the gospel, won't you come now while we stand and sing?